So it's a pleasure being here. I did see the 737, is it, the United Jet, and I'm old enough to have flown on that particular carrier. At any rate, I am going to say some things that are, I guess, provocative, but I'm already in trouble with the social entrepreneurship community, and that's my job. I'm a contrarian. And that's our job, really, in terms of our research and teaching is to speak truth to power, in terms of the conventional wisdom that may or may not be grounded in reality. And I picked the term here, Proverbs, because I've been doing quite a bit of reading about the history of public administration as a field. I'm working with the former Federal Reserve Board Chairman Paul Volcker. We just set up a new 501c3 nonprofit to promote integration and conversation about policy execution as part of the policymaking process, high up in the process. Because Paul Volcker believes that the failure to consider execution at the very start of the design process is a near guarantee of failure later in the process. So we're working on that, and USC will no doubt be part of that conversation. And we've talked about the Price School behind your back, or I can't remember whether you talked with Paul or not. I can't remember. Briefly. Well, he's interested. So this is a good place to think about it. And, you know, the Proverbs of administration were very important. An article published by Herbert Simon before he came to RAND. He was at the Illinois Institute of Technology. He came to RAND. This particular article was published in 1946. And then he did quite a bit of work at RAND and ended up at Carnegie Mellon and, you know, won the Nobel Prize for Economics and so forth. But his notion about the Proverbs of administration, this article came at a moment of really great influence from the public administration community on government management. We had publication of the Principles of Administration from the Institute of Public Administration, Luther Gulick, and other leaders in the field. This was followed by the Brownlow Commission, which established and, you know, gave the impetus behind the creation of the Executive Office of the President and reorganization authority for the President, which I'm telling you, Barack Obama desperately wants, but he will never get. And it expired in 1984 as part of the INS v. Chadha overturning of the legislative veto. But the Hoover Commissions came along after Simon authored his article. But the notion was that a lot of what public administration was producing and labeling as principles were actually proverbs. And that public administration had not proven the assertion, for example, that the span of control between a superior and a subordinate should be no greater than 1 to 6. That had not been proven. It was asserted, and strongly so, and played out over time with the aging of the federal workforce. It has produced, that proverb has produced an incredibly thick administrative hierarchy, because we have followed the 1 to 6 span of control for the most part, and as the federal government grew, that pushed up the distance between top and bottom, and Simon writes about it in 1946 and says, you know, this is one of the contradictions embedded in the proverb. Now, I've used the term social entrepreneurship here, but there's a debate about what that term actually means, its relevance. Aren't we really talking about social innovation? What about social enterprise? Here in the United States, social enterprise is considered to be a revenue generator of some kind. I view it as a subsidy business or a revenue generator within an organization. That can be a fundraising operation. It can be a fee-for-service operation. It's just a source of subsidy. But we tend to view it as something creative, as part of the sort of whole notion of social entrepreneurship being new. So we can substitute innovation for entrepreneurship, but this is the term in fashion right now. Whether it's going to continue, I just don't know. But there are a group of funders who are active in the arena. And feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions about any of this. But words do matter. The choice of the term entrepreneurship here does matter because it is a direct reference to business entrepreneurship. Social entrepreneurship within this particular community is considered to be very much like business entrepreneurship in most aspects. In the operation, the creation of the new idea, the effort to scale and penetrate the market, and the general effort to create a new social equilibrium, and is therefore based on a lot of the work by the Austrian economists and seen as a kind of twin of business entrepreneurship, except for the fact that the social entrepreneur is not interested in profit.
I wrote a whole book on entrepreneurship when I think of the religious actors,
Right.
Like Moses or,
Right.
Or Augustine, and it struck me as much truer to the tradition of entrepreneurship than anything.
It's possible. It's possible, and I've looked at the prophets from the standpoint of prophetic imagination. How do they create a vision that will draw people into the desert for 40 years? So we should talk. I mean, they can be seen as policy entrepreneurs. There's a whole subfield in political science in the agenda setting. I mean, the entrepreneurial behavior. But whether it's like business entrepreneurship, very different issue, right? So let's go into this a little bit. I did this PowerPoint, these slides. I don't ordinarily do them, but so you'll see they're very entrepreneurial and that they're filled with typos, I'm sure. I have trouble reading PowerPoints on a MacBook, and I only have one chance to go through them, so please forgive me in advance. Let's see if this actually takes us through. So the notion of a proverb is defined as that it's guidance, it's wisdom conveyed through a relatively clear statement of intention and conclusion. This is what you should do. Not necessarily true that a proverb is based on anything more than the conventional wisdom at a given point in time. A lot of stories of success that we might label as parables. And I think if you peruse the literatures on social entrepreneurship, the literatures are filled with parable about individual social entrepreneurs, and we can name them. We can run through the names. Wendy Kopp. Who is she? What? What is the Teach for America, right? Muhammad Yunus, Jeffrey Canada. You can just start running through the names, the books, the stories. So who? Jane Addams is referenced. Andrew Carnegie is referenced. Florence Nightingale is referenced in the Skoll Foundation's list of entrepreneurs. So you get all these names, and no doubt very important, but the stories of their lives, the stories of their interventions have, a rich texture. There are shared events in their lives, but as we'll see, there's not good analysis of what really was important or not important to share. There's work coming out of the Howard Gardner and others who say that all social entrepreneurs tend to share some early experience, traumatic experience. We don't know whether that's true. We don't know what's really going on, but there are proverbs that we're going to go through here. And, good stories. And you'll get people coming in, and we bring people all the time into NYU. We have a fellowship program that's coming to an end. These are very inspirational people. Paul Farmer, that have done great things. Bill Drayton of Ashoka's, mythic entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and so forth down the line. And the stories of their histories, what triggered their engagement. Question is whether or not some of you who are interested in being a social entrepreneur, some of your students should even be thinking about it at this point. Because one of the proverbs is you don't even start thinking about it until you get really angry with your situation in life and you want autonomy. And it's like when you're 35 or 40, come and talk to me. Even though we know that you're already thinking about it today. That's one of the proverbs we'll go through. So I'll just run through some of these and just work it through. Any questions at this point? Yeah.
I often think in terms of Simon's concept of Proverbs that he often thought of the statements as almost contradictory.
Yes, he did.
Both the positive and the negative of the statement could both be true.
Right.
And I don't know if you're thinking about it. It's like look before you leap, but he who hesitates is lost. It's both of those things are true. It depends on the context, and that's kind of the way he, I think,
well, that's certainly
looked at the principles of administration.
Well, he also, was talking quite a bit about the fact that some of them are so vague that they cannot be operationalized, that you can specialize by, he talked about nurses in particular, that they can specialize by field, or they can specialize by region, or whatever, and that it's sometimes quite unclear as to what you're asking for. But yes, and they can be contradicted. Let's say that one of the proverbs is that you should be highly focused on your own idea, and that you should take ownership of it. You should be a visionary. You should own it, hold on to it tight. But when you get to scaling the idea, you should collaborate with others. So the person who is more likely to be the type A, aggressive, pushing forward, may not be much of a collaborator. When it comes time to kind of pooling resources and ideas to create a thrust forward into the social equilibrium, as the community refers to it. So you're quite right. It's an interesting article. So I put together this definition of social entrepreneurship just for your, well, actually, I was trying to figure it out. Did I get the numbering right? So I tried to pick up from the literatures that I've known over the years what it is. So I started out, I used the term social entrepreneurship. Now you might say, why aren't you talking about social entrepreneur? Because when you use the word social entrepreneur, or it's plural, who are you talking about? Or what are you talking about? You're talking about people. Entrepreneurship is an act. And the question for us is whether or not it's an act produced by an individual entrepreneur or something else. So I start out, I didn't talk much about that, but probably the most dominant part of a definition, it's a courageous endeavor. So you got two proverbs in here, sets. Gee, look at me. To create, scale, and execute a new combination of ideas for solving an intractable social problem. And then last night I just added this, permanently. Because that is in the literature on this. It's not, you don't even reach social entrepreneurship status for some people in this field until you have permanently solved the problem. Okay, and this is very familiar to people who are involved in business entrepreneurship, until you have permanently altered the market. I don't know how many of you ever had a flip. Do you remember the flip? It was a video recorder, right? It wasn't a telephone, right? And it's long gone. It's really, gone. I will, look, I'm shedding. I will tell you that I do go out into and talk to nonprofit people, conferences and so forth, and I say, does anybody here have a flip? And there's always one person who does. And he or she will take it out and say, here it is. And I'm like, well, you have the last flip. You are the last flip owner on Earth because they're obsolete. I believe the technology was sold to whom? Cisco. And Cisco wrote it off for, what, $27 last year. It's interesting, though. I was at a Feeding America event. And I really like Feeding America a lot. It's an interesting organization. And I said that to the audience. I said, how many of you have a flip? And everybody raised their hands, you know, and many of them had it with them. And do you know why? It's because Cisco donated every existing flip to the nonprofit sector. You see, and those of you who study nonprofits know that there's nothing more virtuous than somebody to donate a worthless product to a nonprofit. Like you say, like I have this friend in Maine whose computer, you know, he's up to the minute, the latest thing. He's got the iPhone 5, and he'll have whatever comes out, and then he donates whatever is like 10 years old or 5 years old because he wants to keep a stream of older stuff, but not too long. He'll donate it to the local nonprofit, which has a 386, you know, and now they've got something a little bit better, and he's like, look at me, how virtuous am I? And I'm like, oh, that nonprofit must really be so excited because they can run some COBOL-based application. So in the business world, you know, you get permanent changes in the market, and we're never going back. So vinyl records become vintage, and some of us still keep our collections, and, you know, it's an issue of, you know, keeping our turntables going. And there's been like a little bit of innovation in turntablery and so forth. But let's just work with that definition and see where it carries us. And that's what I was doing yesterday. I was just thinking, okay, well, let's take that definition. Courageous is a word that's often used. There are other words. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know about this literature as well as I obviously should. Can you tell me an intractable social problem that's been solved permanently?
Would you let me get to the proverb? But that term is often used. It's intractable, but by definition, if it's intractable, it cannot be solved. Is that correct? So it's a little bit of a language issue, and you know that is a problem. But it's not intractable. So this notion is almost really more like that people believe it cannot be solved because it's basically a human nature issue, or it's inevitable that there's going to be poverty or whatever. So it's defined as intractable, but it's really not because it can be solved. I mean, you know, it's kind of a rabbit hole that you can go down into, but of course, you know, you ask a good question. So let's just take a look at courageous. So the proverb here is that courage is the most important resource for social entrepreneurship, but you hear lots of other things. You hear people use different words. Perseverance. Teach for America is all about grit. You know, the analysis of Teach for America core members suggests it's really all about intelligence and being a student at a certain kind of college. You know, but I don't know. There aren't good evaluations of you know, grit. There's not good measure. Fortitude, tenacity. The Skoll Foundation has a list, and you see these different lists. The Echoing Green Foundation, which is located in New York City, very small seed funder, used to be a seed funder of new nonprofits, changed its brand to social entrepreneurship, was developing a social entrepreneur index several years ago to help you measure whether you were a social entrepreneur. But they didn't go very far with it. It didn't have any kind of face validity, and they were actually concerned about that. So courage is the most important. And it's like courage when facing almost certain failure, that you're going to proceed and that you're going to move forward. And can that be contradicted? And that can that be tested? We have some experiments in the business entrepreneurship community about, and these are all psych lab experiments where we use students to teach us about whether or not people who make investments in new ideas are courageous or risk takers, what kind of heuristics they use, and courage can be redefined as foolishness. That you'll take on a task with absolutely no chance of success, and that you'll continue to invest in that task well beyond the point at which you have discovered that you will fail. And the experiments on this are, in fact, about ideas where one group is told that they're both given the same script, of course. The only variation, I think you and I talked about this, earlier. The only variation in the experiment is that one group is told that their idea is going to fail, certain to fail. Then they're asked how much additional out of a pool of money they would invest. The control group is told the same thing, only their idea is going to succeed. The people who are going to certainly fail will invest much more than the people who won't. So my favorite proverb, I was looking at this morning to see what proverb that I like the most for me, is that a tumbleweed in the hands of a drunkard is no more dangerous than a proverb in the mouth of a fool. And so I thought, well, that would that might explain how you would react to this, because these are ones that come to mind as you think about the literatures on social entrepreneurship. And this goes to your point, this second one, that business and social entrepreneurship are alike in most important aspects. And that the major motivation really is financial versus social profit. That is a dominant point of view in the field, and that the social equilibrium behaves very much like the economic equilibrium. That when you have a breakthrough like a smartphone in the economic world, that it breaks through the equilibrium and it resets the equilibrium to a new position, and the old is gone. Now, I think we could have a nice debate here about whether that is true of social entrepreneurship. Does the equilibrium, and this goes to your initial question, does the equilibrium fade so that the change is permanent? Does the market in economic terms break and fade so that the change is permanent? And we could have good debates about both of those, but my sense from the social world, and why we have schools of public service, public affairs, public policy, public administration, is that the social equilibrium is quite different. And what Graham Allison might say, and he wrote a similar article, titled article, where he said, are business and government fundamentally alike in all unimportant aspects? And his answer was basically yes. That business doesn't teach us very much about government, but of course now one of the most popular ways of talking about government is that government should be more business-like. And I should say that having sat on a handful of nonprofit boards and foundation boards, but no corporate boards, and I'd like to. So if you have one or two available, I have a friend who is on the Hostess board. He was appointed by as an independent director, so he made nothing, and he couldn't get me anything. I mean, I kept saying, "Where's the case of Hostess cupcakes?" Because I rather preferred those, but he couldn't get me anything because he was morally centered. It's another proverb, yeah. But I have never heard a board of a nonprofit or a philanthropy say, let's become more like government. And they never say, let's become more nonprofit-like. Because as you know, nonprofit is a term with no meaning other than what you're not. It has no aspirational content at all. Oh, I want to be a nonprofit executive. Oh, okay, what does that mean? And we actually tested the term in a survey that we were doing on confidence in charities. And when we asked people, what do the words nonprofit, what does the word nonprofit mean to you? What do you think they said? What do you think the dominant response was in the test? What does the word nonprofit mean? What? No. But, I mean, you'd hope so. What?
No tax.
No.
You don't make money.
Yeah, sort of. What do you think? For the general public, it is a failed business or an about to fail business. It just, when you ask about charitable organizations, you get a little better traction. About half of the respondents will tell you that a charitable organization is what does those words mean to you? The Salvation Army, the American Heart Association, the Red Cross, my local church, so forth and so on. About 2/5 will say, will reference behaviors. Charitable organizations are always asking for money. That was the dominant response in that category. And then 10% don't know. So at any rate, I guess my point here is that in the social world, the differences between the two, between the social equilibrium and the economic equilibrium, seem to me to be quite significant, particularly since in the social world, there is always, there's rarely the death of an idea. The old equilibrium may be pushed aside, but it is not destroyed necessarily, right? So we were talking, right after Obamacare passes, some of you will remember that Sarah Palin and others, and we did talk about this, Sarah Palin and others began to push states to nullify the statute. Now, my shock about this was that, as most of you will know because you're in a school of public policy and affairs, the Supreme Court invalidated, declared nullification unconstitutional some decades ago, like 200 years ago. So here it is coming back. It's like this old equilibrium is coming back all the time, and it's often coming back because of an election or a fiscal cliff or whatever. So it's never set, and that goes to the issue about whether this can be done permanently, because it's not. Well, maybe it can be. I don't know. Were you asking whether an intractable problem can be solved permanently, or whether any problem can be solved permanently? Yeah. Apparently, the fact that I'm breathing can be solved permanently if viewed as a problem. Yes?
Well, you could certainly make the argument that we do get to different policy equilibria, that there's some point at which we didn't have Social Security and it was unthinkable that the government would provide pensions to old people. And it's hard to imagine now that developed countries would go back to a situation where those just aren't offered. We didn't always have public financing of secondary education. Again, it's hard to imagine that we would at some point say the government should no longer pay. That's really interesting. I could quibble a little bit on Social Security because I'm just knowledgeable enough to be dangerous. But taxation of benefits and retirement age increases. The question about trading, 2 good years of retirement for 2 bad years of retirement. I don't know. We're changing it, but it's relatively stable, perhaps. Now, if you're in the discretionary budget, it's not stable, at least from a funding standpoint. And you can argue that the failure to invest in capacity to execute has made implementation not stable. So the best way to change the laws right now, I would argue, is to just disinvest in the ability to execute the laws.
by cutting the workforce and denying this and that. Do you know what I mean? But it's an interesting point. Now, could you argue that the bureaucratic equilibrium is stable? Herbert Kaufman wrote a wonderful book for Brookings some years ago titled "Are Government Organizations Immortal?" Right? And his answer was yes. So, for the most part, yes. And they maintain their immortality. They seem to be able to survive, like the Federal Helium Reserve, which 15 years ago we abolished. But we're actually having a helium shortage, and thank God. I don't know, so I think this is a very good question. I think it's a very good question. You should work on this. And you're at the right school to work on this. So I think you're asking questions about things that I'm just presenting as proverbs that I'm deriving from the field. And they are all, they are not principles because they haven't been validated or tested. I think that's a great question. But can you imagine going back to an era where there isn't, did you say post-secondary or primary education funding? Okay. Well, I mean, you could argue that TFA, Teach for America, exists almost entirely because of inequities in school finance, and that they say they're working on solving an intractable problem, but in fact they're working on solving an intractable symptom of a problem. You've gotten me so unsettled about this intractable issue. Yeah. So, and I should say that this is totally a digression in a field of digression for me. But Teach for America has started accepting contracts from school districts that want to fire senior teachers and replace them with TFA core members. Now, TFA core members do okay when they're matched against novice teams, just like I could say something right now, but I'm going to use a different example. Just like Michigan does pretty well when matched against Appalachian State, except when they don't. I was in Kansas City like 3 weeks ago, or no more than 3 weeks ago, but it was right after my Tigers, my Detroit Tigers, had won the Central Division. And this year, right. And I have a Detroit jacket that I wear around New York. Talk about risk-taking. But the Yankee fan, and I'm sure there's none here, basically says to the Detroit fan that you are so lucky to have played us, and we relaxed because you're so awful. And that's why you won. It's kind of a backdoor kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, well, that's a great team. They were really motoring. All I care about is winning against the Yankees. That's all I care about. Nothing else matters. I couldn't care less after that point. But I've digressed so far, I can't remember where I'm trying to get to. Well, this is a proverb. It's not a principle. It's just a statement that you can derive from reading the texts. The primary texts in the field. David Bornstein's How to Change the World. Still a bestseller, very popular. You can go through these primary texts that we assign and derive these proverbs. And we shall proceed. Endeavor. This is, to me, really the most difficult proverb and the one that I've confronted the most and the one where I get in trouble the most, that within the field of social entrepreneurship, the individual is king or queen, the individual. Now, I can argue to you that the focus on the individual is in part because the mechanism for supporting social entrepreneurship is fellowships. Fellowships do not go to teams or organizations or groups. That's why I tend to favor the use of competitions to make awards and investments in ideas that are being developed by groups of people or organizations, because you get the individual out of there. But not only is it the product of individuals, there aren't very many of them. Bill Drayton and I kind of got to blows on this because he says there's 1 per 10 million. I mean, they're very hard to find. And there are 2,500 Ashoka Fellows. But is that really true? That there's 1 social innovator per 10 million, if we want to use that word instead? I don't know. They share similar traits and habits and experiences, but we're not quite sure what those are. But they are considered to have come along a path that's similar, but we don't know what path it is. We haven't figured that one out. Some argue that they are autonomy seekers, that they come to entrepreneurial behavior. I don't know whether this is true in your work. They come to entrepreneurial behavior in business because they're tired of working for other people, especially other people who are stupid, right? They want out. They've been abused. They're frustrated. They're angry. They're going to start their own business. And you're saying, no, that's not true in your work. No, you're right. Moses was working for a rather powerful and sometimes angry boss, but he wasn't going anywhere.
Let me just say something.
Yeah.
Proverbs are nice. They're the thing that sell books, all right? You know, there's 7. If you go to FedEx, they always have a bunch of books. How to succeed in 7 ways.
Starbucks, too. The guy who created Starbucks has a book that's always for sale.
All right.
Yeah.
I think that those things are always useful retrospectively for telling your story.
Right.
All the talk about testing these things is junk, to my mind.
You mean don't do it,
You
or?
can do whatever you want, but you're
Okay.
not going to prove anything because it assumes a kind of mechanistic view of how we're doing it, which is just not obviously true. It may be true, but that's not obvious. If you were empirical and you say, let's study 100 social entrepreneurs and find out what's going on, and maybe you're effect, you might get someplace. In other words, start with the group of people. But that's not what these people are doing. They typically say, I succeeded and here's how. Or they've gone to 4 people and done it. For examples. None of this stuff, I mean, all this stuff is wonderful as a list. It couldn't ask for more, but it has nothing to do with anything you want to believe.
Look, I mean, I don't know whether to applaud you or kiss you, but that's my point, isn't it?
Yes, but it's more than that. It's the whole idea that there's these secret weapons. That if you only got the 7 habits of highly, whatever. I mean, you'll find those people, but you meant to find those 7 habits do you no good, and we find it all the time.
Right.
And it's a mechanical theory of human motivation.
Correct.
And rather than saying that some people succeed, let's see what they do, let's look at the situation, and so forth. But that would not satisfy the proverbial, I use the word proverbial now, the proverb like me. And that's what's interesting about this proverb, because this really reveals our prejudices about how we think the world works.
I feel like I'm with a group of like-minded, at least you. I mean, and you're the first person to agree with me, and I can't remember how long, so.
But that's so obvious, because, for example, the analogy with economics.
Right.
Where did they get this idea? I mean, it's all a series of prejudices with no empirical foundation at all. If you go look at specific cases, you may learn something. But unfortunately, usually what you learn will not necessarily tell you how you should become that person. That's the thing. There's no.
Well, it may, yes, but
You may model yourself. I'm going to be like Augustine.
right. But if your goal is to activate lots of people to get out there and do something, maybe you go this route. But they are proverbs, and I'm trying to get at this a different way. I'm trying to make the same case you're making, that we need to test them or not use them. So we got all these students. We've got a new center on social entrepreneurship, right? It's great. And if you do this kind of work, everybody will hate you. But you should do this kind of work to actually see what can be taught. I thought I showed one of you this book that I'm reading now because I've been using these different metaphors for trying to explain how social innovation might occur. And I finally found the metaphor that works for people who do this. And I'm reading about it. And this goes to your point. The question being whether I can actually find the book in this very complicated briefcase. Well, I got the book, but go ahead.
So for our first couple of comments here, the group is setting new goals, they turn into more traits. It seems to me so far like we're mostly talking about well-known and successful entrepreneurs, and that's obviously where the social selection lies. So in the economic analogy, you learn a lot by studying firms that fail. There are lots and lots of entrepreneurs who could be some small businesses together.
Correct.
I would assume that you have a similar analogy on the social side.
Of course. Except that we don't know of any failures. We don't have a panel survey on entrepreneurial dynamics. So in this particular field, if it can be called a field, there are no available inventories of failed social innovators that I know of. I have talked with several of you. We can imagine different methodologies for getting at this. We could take Ashoka Fellows and track them back in time. We could take applicants or nominees for different grant programs and try to construct a control group design. We could do lots of things, but when you say, where are the failed social entrepreneurs, and they must be out there, we know that there are failed nonprofits, right? We have decertified, what, 400,000? Taken back their tax-exempt status for failure to file 3 consecutive years. And the IRS continues to do this and will be doing this for a long time. There are lots of nonprofits that go through the hell of creating, of getting IRS certification and then eventually die off, and we now have a mechanism for killing them, which is failure to file. And we're going to be killing a lot of them. The IRS expects to do about 5,000 to 10,000 decertifications a month, fairly far into the future. But incidentally, last year, we created 65,000 new nonprofits. And this year, you've already heard me say that we created one, which is the Volcker Alliance for Effective Government. So we're creating. That feels very much like small business, you know. So there must be failures, right? That's what you're assuming, right? Can you find me one? I'm just saying that I mean, I was at Pew, I was a grant maker, and every grant I made, I've said this morning, was a success. Unbelievably so. I knew how to pick successes. But if you got me on a more candid moment, I might say 20% were very successful, 60% were mediocre, and 20% were absolute failures. And maybe 20% is not high enough for effective grant making. You know, where's my philanthropy? I guess he didn't. Oh, yeah. So what should be a success rate for philanthropy? And some will tell you. Right. But I think it may be higher, but they're not telling. But it'd be an interesting conversation to have. So we don't know much about failure, and we think it exists, but we have not created the database.
It's a fairly obvious one. Okay, that's disillusioned collectivists. There have been many experiments of collectivism over the years, and the disillusioned ones those who joined the Communist Party or the Trotskyist movement, those on the extreme, are now quite just realizing, hey, we didn't succeed. Why didn't we succeed? And we had every favorable circumstance. And the kibbutzniks have now disappeared. Again, they were the original group. Totally disillusioned.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. I agree that you could find pockets like that. There's now the development of the urban kibbutz, which is really an interesting model. We'll see, you know. I was there in September. Great timing. I mean, the only better time to have gone would have been like 2 weeks ago. Well, you get my drift. You know, it's a very tense moment, but I think we should pool our thoughts and start saying, can you think of some social innovators or innovations that have failed? And we know some that have underperformed, right? So we can come up with those lists. But here is a fundamental lack of pre-post test where we can see what works, what doesn't, that we see as very familiar in some fields, but not here. So.
Underperforming is being very generous.
What?
I think your term underperforming is very generous.
In what way?
You know, you still, maybe there's hope that if they revise and come back again, they might succeed one day, but it's thousands of years now, and every experiment has somehow disappeared.
Well, that's okay. Well, it's been great talking to you today, and I really appreciate. Did you have a question back there at one point?
We still have 10 more.
Oh, look, I mean, you know, the point is well made already. Here's this is a Bill Drayton quote. It's perfect. Existing institutions are not able to make such judgments. Sally Osberg, who runs the Skoll Foundation, which is a big player in this field, and Roger Martin, who is dean of the University of Toronto School of Business, wrote this scathing indictment of social service organizations that they can never permanently break out of their limited frame of reference. They cannot do anything innovative. And then they conclude with my very familiar proverb that I didn't put up, that social service organizations are doing honorable work, but they're doing nothing to make the world better. Now, when you go out and talk to these organizations, of course, you get a different story. And many of them are innovating. It's not their full-time preoccupation, but they are fine-tuning and changing process and doing work. And the sort of complete rejection of institutional capacity to innovate, it's just unbelievable, really. And you know, we've got these huge and then you've got the example of the Carnegie as a social entrepreneur. Now, I spent time in Philadelphia. Anybody here from Philly? You know what's happened to the Philadelphia Library? How's that working in terms of permanent solution? I mean, libraries are dying and trying to reinvent themselves, right? I mean, that's happening, has to be happening here. These big hub and branch libraries. So we can just run through this and kind of, we've got to create, I mean, this is fun. I mean, it's really fun when you are talking to the entrepreneurs, and this is true that the stories are wonderful. I love the stories to a point until you start drawing on the stories to say this is what you should do. You should have a lemon drop martini with some friends, and you're going to come up with an idea for preventing childhood obesity. Well, that's kind of interesting, and you've got this old garage theory of entrepreneurship. All of these, the person who invented Dress for Success, do you know this program? You know, for women who are on welfare in some cases, but looking for work. It's, you know, the person who came up with the idea that kind of thought about it on an elevator. it's kind of interesting. And I keep saying to her, why? Why on an elevator? This is what you would do, you know. Why on an elevator? Why not on a stair? Should we tell everybody now to take elevators? And should they? But it's fun. I mean, and then of course, this is the task to identify a stable but inherently unjust equilibrium. You'll see later if you read through these slides that it must be permanent. And that's part of the, you've got scale. This is Bill Drayton's notion that scaling is not like opening a 13th department store. And he then writes, so very few of the Fortune 500 companies from several decades ago still make the list or even exist precisely because managers took over. There's an anti-institutionalism in here that you should do this, you should grow, and the growth is no longer seen as solely budget, but you should get bigger but avoid management. Scaling is generally considered nonpartisan, that you're going to work with lots of different people, and that there's no contest here, that the idea is so powerful that partisanship, politics, it's not there. Execute. This is, you know, what we've talked about in terms of business. New. Here's Bill Drayton again. This is what I was talking. Some of you want to be a social entrepreneur, because I sure hope so. And we're going to teach you how to do it, but in a conditioned way. But here's Bill Drayton saying that he's suspicious about somebody who comes up with an idea 2 years ago. Typical entrepreneur, you can see the roots of interest, but not the idea when they're very young. So I'm doubting that Wendy Kopp was thinking about Teach for America when she was 6 years old. So the interest is very young, but this is the idea and interest. Well, I'm making the point over and over, aren't I? Right? Yeah. I wish I could find something really, we've got this combination of ideas. There is kind of a stage gate approach to the way ideas are created and managed. That you start here and you move steadily up a chain, and that is sometimes the artifact of writing a book, a narrative about an idea or an entrepreneur, or teaching a course about the policy process, for example. You know, you start here, you move up, you've got 14 weeks, you've got 14 chapters. We start at the beginning, at birth, and then we go all the way up. When I go out and talk to people who are engaged in one way or other and you know, these stories and cross-check and so forth, they don't talk that way at all. And I finally I've been trying to come up with a metaphor to help explain how this stuff occurs. And a physicist friend of mine said that I should look at this as the traveling salesman problem. It's one of two of the great mathematical puzzles that's never been solved. What is the optimal route to make X number of visits? And the original, I was looking at this morning again, and it's really interesting that Procter & Gamble, I believe, was a Procter & Gamble? Yeah. Offered a $10,000 prize in 1962 if they could, for the person who could come up with the best route for the two officers in car 54. You remember car 54, where are you? Officer Tootie and Muldoon, to visit 33 locations around the country in the shortest route possible. It is impossible to solve this, or at least we haven't gotten there yet.
The point is that, in fact, you can solve this problem very well, very close to optimally, very quickly. And that's what people who in OR do for a living.
Right.
And they can help Procter & Gamble easy. So the whole idea that it's an unsolvable problem is a very narrow definition of what the unsolvable problem is. Because what you're saying is, I want a perfect solution, and I want the solution. When in fact, what you should be asking is, does your algorithm or your heuristic work a very very large fraction of the time. And I think that's what's floating around down here. Lots of these proverbs can be useful guides, but none of them, I think that's what makes them bad, is none of them are very good. In the sense,
Right.
in other words, what you want is a set of proverbs which might be helpful, all right, or guides.
Or principles.
Yeah, that would work, say, half the time, all right, a quarter of the time, you know, rather than 99% like the common sense.
Well, okay, but you know, there's a question about optimal versus suboptimal. Some people would argue that resiliency is a suboptimal. You know, creating resiliency, let's say in Lower Manhattan, for flood surge is a suboptimal because it's very costly and it probably won't be needed except for every 6 months or so, which is what we're now thinking. You get the joke. I mean, it's not a joke either, but I get your point. I mean, and I'm saying that, okay, so how do we get from there? Let's just skip ahead. You know, we got ideas here, solving. This is interesting that this community will not declare something as a successful act of social entrepreneurship unless the problem is permanently solved. Okay? Intractable, social problem, and this is the kind of common definition, permanently. I'm just putting this up here to say that this word comes up.
Yeah, Carnegie says good and permanent good or something like that, right?
Right. I remember when I was at the Pew Trust and we were trying to invent a tagline for Pew, and the agreed upon tagline was ideas for results. And one of my colleagues said, why not just call Pew the other white bread? Because it didn't make sense. They came up with something better. But look, I mean, I think what we'd agree on here is that we can get some traction on this. But it's not going to make us very popular. Because what are we going to do? We're going to go out and look for control groups. Less well-performing, not at all well-performing. I mean, we're going to build a database. But people are going to have to tell us, we're going to have to figure out how to define performance. We're going to have to figure out how to measure it. We're going to have to convince our funders to allow us to do some type of pre and post ongoing evaluation of some kind. Actually, this is a pretty old idea. But it hasn't shown up in this particular field.
It doesn't show up, by the way, in business either. Most business books, popular books about business, or even though that's, you know, the ones that come from academics, are just like these proverbs. There's no difference. You know, when they talked about, what was that word, you know, specialties. I forgot, some guy from Michigan had some notion of core competencies.
Right.
It was a popular idea. It might be true. You know, it got him famous and so forth.
Well, this is the 8 characteristics of the companies in the search for excellence. The 6 habits of high-performing nonprofits. I mean, I've been guilty of it. I had once a list of 28 characteristics of innovative nonprofits in Minnesota. They were so good they had 28, but I had no control group. And at one point, I was very interested in studying failure, but it's not very popular. You start to get, I mean, at the time in Minnesota, I got some money from Ford to look at the sustainable, you know, all the examples in Reinventing Government by Osborne and Gabler, what happened to them, because there were 50 or 60 from Minnesota, and by the time the book, Reinventing Government, went from hard to paper, a third of the examples were dead, another third were near dead, more like the Walking, Living, what is it? What's the new program that's so popular? The Walking Dead, or yeah. And the other third were doing just fine, and people didn't like it, and I didn't like always going out and visiting with people about failure. It's not fun. You call somebody to set up a site visit once you get that reputation, and you say, I'm Paul Light calling, and they're like, drop the phone. go to the cash drawer, and they're out of there. You know, so this is hard stuff. So where do we get the data to implement this old idea, which is to actually look for opportunities to compare and contrast? Because we're going to teach students and others, we're going to be asked, you know, help us. What can we do? And we're left with nothing but proverbs. I don't know. Well, okay, let's start back there with here.
So following on this agenda here, if we take Wendy Cobb, who you've used as an example several times, and say, has Teach for America worked? Is it really social entrepreneurship? Looking at 1 through 12, I'll give her credit for 1 through 8, but solving an intractable social problem permanently, some people would say that what she is succeeding in doing is delegitimizing education as a profession, delegitimizing the role of the state in public education. So how are we actually, and from what I've seen, at least with charter schools, there's no overall net effect that they're better. So the question is is TFA social entrepreneurship? I mean, how do we make those last 4 stick?
Well, I agree with you. I think you could make an argument, for example, that TFA is enabling the financing disparities that produce empty classrooms in poor urban neighborhoods.
But then what we get is social entrepreneurship is the other side of the new public management coin. It's a way to co-opt things.
Well, it might be. It could be that social entrepreneurship enables the problems it seeks to solve by creating the impression that they can be solved through social entrepreneurship, and we don't really need WIC anymore. So go ahead and cut it. It's in the discretionary budget. Let's get rid of it. We don't really need so many Head Start programs, you know, because we can do it this way. But that could be an enabling function. So you can get all sorts of unintended consequences. You guys know all about this. And, you know, you bring some analytics to bear along with the knowledge of capacity building and execution. You can get some traction on this and say, you know, what's really going on here? You know, is TFA successful? Well, they've done some control group evaluation, and they're pretty good matched up against novice teachers. Slightly better on math, about the same on reading. Like, you know, Michigan is pretty good against small colleges, but not very good against Ohio State. Again, out of respect for where I am, I know you had a lot of hope. But see, the thing about Michigan that I always loved, and I would recommend to you, is that Michigan was really gracious in losing early to Appalachian State or Ball State or whatever, so we had no hope of a national championship. But I think, well, anyway, I don't want to go there. But you get this. When you look at TFA and you match TFA teachers against core members, and the innovation is the 5-week curriculum. Take a really smart kid coming out of an Ivy League school or top-ranked school, give them 5 weeks of instruction, and they're going to be just as good in filling that classroom as a novice teacher or any teacher. But actually, they don't do well matched up against experienced teachers. And that's not to say that all experienced teachers are good. There are poor performers, and the consequence of being taught by a poorly performing teacher are quite extreme, quite high. But I don't know. I mean, there are 250 million. I heard last week that they are now getting more than half of all the money for education reform coming out of the hedge fund community. That's a lot of money. And they are really growing fast. They'll be at 500 million in another couple of years, but most nonprofits don't make it that far. They really don't get that big. You had a question?
Yeah, I just want to give just one point, but I want to come back to my main question, is that all this search for excellence, when the book came out, half of those big companies all disappeared within 2 years
Right.
of the book coming out. It's just
Like
it goes back to my main thing I want to raise. The behind all this, there are two words I'm afraid I was listening for and I didn't come across.
Okay.
That was, one was social responsibility,
Right.
and the other one is social justice. And behind social entrepreneurship, there has to be those two dominant driving forces. Otherwise, it's going to be like the business world.
Well, yeah.
We go
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, and you know, the hottest concept right now is actually impact investing. It's not eclipsing social entrepreneurship, but it's very, very hot right now. And we're talking about social impact bonds and those kinds of things, but I don't see those getting deep traction. So your point is well made. Yes.
I'd like to hear your ideas on what the relationship between social entrepreneurship and public sector governance is. And I ask that because bubbling around this, there's a lot of suggestion that some of these ideas from nonprofits could somehow substitute, supplement governance. But what's the relationship?
Well, you know, from my point of view, governments are the ultimate scalers of innovation. And if you write off government as impossibly difficult to work with, you have now placed the scaling function entirely on philanthropy or business enterprise of one kind or another. So there has to be a relationship, and there has to be a willingness to argue about the government policy agenda and the ability of government to execute on an idea that actually is proven to work. So does that go to?
What confuses me, in a democratic governance context, you have that argument for the notions of justice. What should the objectives be? It seems like the definition of social entrepreneurship is close to, I'm an individual and I wanted to do something, which is really something to the way governments work. So this is where it seems like the concept of social entrepreneurship needs more structure before we can plug it into our idea of democratic governance.
Well, I mean, we, as I said earlier, we've got a long tradition of talking about policy entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship for shaping the policy agenda. I mean, I get your point. And I mean, one of the things that perplexes me is how social entrepreneurship and the community remains really very astutely unengaged in the big debates of the time. Now, on the education front, Teach for America, New Leaders for New Schools, these kinds of organizations have been very active in the charter school movement. But, you know, it's a really good question to raise. And it doesn't get raised very often. But for what? What's the purpose of the social entrepreneurship? You know, well, in this big definition that I showed you a little bit ago, you know, it's to create a just social equilibrium. But how is just defined? You know, and that is a fundamentally, I mean, let me tell you just a quick story. I got initial funding for some of this work from a foundation, very large, that was very interested in entrepreneurship. But the deeper I went into this work, the more the foundation began to say, well, wait a second, what you're ultimately studying is redistribution, methods for redistribution. And we don't like that because we're about business entrepreneurship. Yeah, but I'm saying that they were like, you know, you're ultimately looking at projects and so forth that are anti-capitalist. Well, that's what they were saying. I mean, and we're not going to fund that anymore. And I don't know whether they are or not. When we talk about education, what are we talking about? You know, I mean, what's it all about? You had a question.
Yes, I guess my question is, are we holding social entrepreneurs to too high of a standard? Is that maybe the challenge? So when we say solve an intractable problem permanently, is that a higher standard than we're holding for business entrepreneurship or policy entrepreneurship, where a business entrepreneur, no one would say that a business that's growing every year and increasing profit, as opposed to monopolizing the market, is that I mean, that's success, that's entrepreneurship in the business sector. But we're asking social entrepreneurs to essentially eradicate a problem rather than work towards solving the problem. And policy entrepreneurship is just getting the law passed. And so maybe the
Well.
problem is, maybe the problem is where we have such a high standard for it that
Well, okay.
America seems very entrepreneurial.
Okay, this is a good point, but let me just like tease you a little bit about how easy it is to pass a bill. Go fix the fiscal cliff, you know, I mean, so I think it's difficult on that side too, but I think that's a brilliant observation. Who are you?
PhDs.
You're really, yeah, well. Everybody else is like, you know, that's great, that's great. But, you know, I think it's a great observation. And, you know, it's propelled forward by this industry of funders that think this is the answer. And therefore, you know, woe be to the social entrepreneur who says, I'm not doing so well, or I'm stuck, you know, give me some help. You know, and right now the philanthropic instinct is to put these organizations on the as tubs on their own bottom. After a few years, we're out. There are some big survivors that do well year in and year out, but we were talking about, I know you know William Foster's work on nonprofit growth. He did this study of all the hundreds of thousands of nonprofits created between 72 and 2002, 2004, and of the total, 144 made it to 50 million. So the scaling issue gets to be very difficult. And if you're not going to penetrate government as your scaler, then how are you going to get there? But I mean, that's a really good comment. I think it's worth saying.
I want to bring the discussion for a moment to kind of one of the purposes of these seminars, and that is the funder or the donor for this center, the Center for Social Innovation. We debated about what we call social innovation.
I think you made the right choice.
They were interested in this because they're business entrepreneurs. They started Price Club that merged, became Costco. They really transformed. They created a new equilibrium in the retail industry.
Right.
So that's the way they think. And they live in San Diego. They thought, can we do anything entrepreneurial about trying to address the low-income area of San Diego?
City Heights, right?
In City Heights. So they came up with a model that is self-sustaining. They basically, interestingly enough, you made a point at the beginning, it does require more than one type of government subsidy. And the key government subsidy is the tax write-off for real estate investments that the return from that gets reinvested in the community. They don't pay any taxes on their return. And so they're self-sustaining. They basically invest money in the community. They build low-cost housing, this, that, and so on. And then the money they make off that, they put right back in the community. They don't pay any taxes. And now, you know, this is not a be-all and end-all for the community, but it has, I think, made a positive impact on the community. The other thing is they've decided to stay there over a long period of time. It's not like a lot of foundations come in, seed fund thing for 5 years. They decided they've been there many, many, many years. They're in the community. And they also do benefit from, or they have benefited from redevelopment agencies in the sense that governments have condemned property and, you know, the governments have worked with them in public-private partnerships to redevelop some parts of City Heights. So that's why they're interested in this center and why they're interested in funding it. But they're doing what we're doing. They're kind of struggle, well, what does this mean in a university context? What does this mean for education? We talked about we should look at their model, for example, versus what some other foundations have done in other parts of the country on revitalizing urban neighborhoods, to see if you could actually identify 2-3 different approaches to this and what are the strengths and weaknesses. So we're trying to conceptualize a center that is attractive to them because they think of themselves as social entrepreneurs and also has some academic value for education and research and scholarly reputation. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that. I don't know, even if you probably don't know that much about City Heights, but just that notion of here's some business people, they came up with, I think, a fairly, I don't know if it's unique, but it's innovative model. It's self-sustaining. They are making a difference in the community. I mean, there's still some issues, obviously, but they are making some difference in that community. They want to know if this is, they'd like to try this in other cities. They'd like to learn whether there are other similar models to this that might be improve on what they're doing, things like that. Does that fit within your, I mean, is it all just fluff and proverbs?
No.
We haven't, I'm trying to get at.
The point, though, here, Jack, is...
I know the literature has some of these issues in it, but I'm trying to get at what can we tease out of what we've just heard that might help us think through what this center's
Okay.
intellectual agenda,
Okay. Well,
educational agenda.
here's the proverb. 2 cases are better than 1. And I actually think that's a principle. I mean, if the funder, and a lot of the people involved in this are tech entrepreneurial funders. They moved quickly, but they always knew where they stood. And if you ask the Price family or people involved in that, or you ask Pierre Omidyar and Jeff Skoll, they knew exactly where they stood. And I'm no fan of Facebook, although I do like Words with Friends because it allows me to cheat. And those of you who play it know it. They knew exactly where they are. Then they get into this business, let's call it business, they don't know where they are at all. They have no data. They have no comparison groups. If your funder says, gee, this stuff in City Heights is really working, the question would be, how do you know that? And then what about interventions that are similar in other areas and interventions that are not as comprehensive? And where are your control groups? I mean, I think our job, especially in a center like this, and it's going to be interesting to have the conversation with the funder, is to be social explorers. Our job is to go out there and see what's really happening and measure it carefully as we can. And I think it's our job to say, this isn't working. The data show us that it's not working. It could work better because we've been in this community and that community, and they're doing something that's unusual. They're doing a comprehensive, multi-spectrum intervention, as opposed to the siloed single intervention. But you can start to see how that works with control group. You don't have to tell them it's a control group. You can just say, we want to go out and look, and we want some measures of how we're doing. How do they know they're doing better? How do they know that? So that becomes the issue. It's an issue in prevention, health prevention. How do we know that good lunches make a difference, and so forth and so on? Healthy, nutritious food, grocery stores in neighborhoods, health clinics in neighborhoods, those kinds of, how do we know? And if we did know, maybe that would propel further investment. I like to describe what your job is in a center like this as being like a baby on an airplane. Now, I came out here from New York City on JetBlue. It wasn't a good experience. But the plane was almost empty, and the doors are about to close. Well, it wasn't almost empty, but lots of center seats open. and the door's about to close. They're going to say, turn off your cell phones, which nobody ever does, as near as I can tell. And onto the airplane comes a family with a baby. And you know that that's like adorable and cute. You're adorable and cute. You're the Saul Price School. We really like you, but we don't want to sit next to you on an airplane. Because if you're doing your job, you are really going to become uncomfortably irritating. And how you do that without having your benefactor say, I'm sending you away, I'm going to get rid of you, that's a real art, right? So I think centers, and there just aren't very many of them, right? How many do you count? I count one at this point, but maybe there's another one someplace. No, on that one. Well, sort of. You mean the Catherine Reynolds? She decided that she didn't want to make the last of her contributions to the program. The program is, let's not talk about that. Duke's program is in, the Sanford School does not do social entrepreneurship. That's over in the business school. Yes, but they really got a different kind of tone and focus. Anyway, I think you are, I'm just putting the pressure on, and I think you've got a wonderful opportunity here to make a real contribution. You've got a very strong cast of scholars who do both execution and policy analysis and policy. It's great. So speak truth to power, but do it in a nice way. That's good.